Alrighty, just to recap, here's our gulp file, here's our project, pretty straightforward, basically what we've been doing this entire series. So let's go ahead and talk about the module loading syntax. Remember, as of right now, no browsers understand the module loading syntax, but it is standardized, it is a part of ES2015. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the syntax, and again, nothing that we write in this video is going to do anything because we have no way yet to load the modules. So this video and the next video is purely about the syntax, and we're going to be throwing together some simple JavaScript. There's not going to be a whole lot of it, and unfortunately we're not going to be able to quite test it yet because we don't have a runtime, but that's okay. I want there to be some code in this application so that we can watch the transform as it happens. So speaking of watching, I'm going to come over here to my command line and I'm going to go ahead and start the watch task. I'm just going to do gulp dev watch, and now we're watching. I'll move this guy off to another monitor so I can keep an eye on it in case I run into any errors, so that I can go ahead and full screen code so we get a little bit more room. All right, so modules. Let's go ahead and pop open to our source directory and then pop open scripts. Always be very, very careful that while we're inside of source scripts that we're not inside of public scripts. So be careful, know which file you're editing, the compiled one or the non-compiled one. Once we get going, it should be easy to tell the difference though because of all the stuff that Babel adds to it. Alrighty, so I'm going to clear out application.js and I guess I'm going to show you guys the most common way to import a module. So I'll split the screen so that we can have the compiled code on the left-hand side and our non-compiled code on the compiled on the right, non-compiled on the left, and I'll collapse my Solution Explorer. So this simple application is just going to have a list of users. So we're going to have a list of users, and we're going to be able to add users and delete users, and that's it. Super straightforward list application. But we want to do this with modules. We want to keep our JavaScript files clean, concise, small, and specific so that we can import them in different ways, and we can, well, make this not turn into a maintenance nightmare. So because we're writing an application to store users, the first thing that I want to do is write a class to do that, to handle using or handle storing users, be it, you know, over XSR, Ajax, or whatever, or WebSockets or whatever. So let's go ahead and import a user store. Now this thing I'm gonna do doesn't exist yet, but it'll give us enough to talk about for a second. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hit Control S. So if we look on the left-hand side, we have import user store from models users store. There's quite a bit to talk about in just this one line. First of all, we start off with this import statement. Now, this import statement and this from statement should be colorized as keywords. Unfortunately, it looks like there's a small bug in Visual Studio Code right now, so they are not highlighted, but they should be. These are keywords. So we start off with import, and that's basically what we're going to do every time we want to, well, import another module. So what comes after the import is interesting. There's a little mini syntax that comes after import, and we're going to be taking a look at a handful of different variants of what we can type in here. But in this case, I'm saying import, and then inside of curly's user store, which means load up the user store module, and then pull in the user store object that was exported from the user store module. We'll see how that works in a second here. Then after the import, after the list of things to import, we do the from keyword, and then we pass in a path. Now, what's interesting about this path is, think about this path in the exact same way that we think about node paths. So I do / models users store. So what does that mean? That means look in the current directory that we're in, /, then open the models folder, and then grab user store out of it. So the user store does not have an extension because the default extension will be .js. So all we have to do is create a users store JS file, and that'll be imported. So before we move on to the user store, let's go ahead and just use it real fast. I'm going to say, so we can talk about the right-hand side. I'm going to say const store equals new user store, and just hit Control S. Now we can talk about the right-hand side, because this should look kind of familiar, actually. What we have going on here is CommonJS. Now remember, There are a handful of different module formats. And the next video, we're going to be exploring the different ways that Babel can, different formats Babel supports, taking this syntax and turning it into straight up JavaScript. But this is the CommonJS format. This is what we've been using in Node the entire time. We have the require function. And in a moment here, we're going to see the exports function, exports object. So it's all very familiar if you've worked with Node. It's all CommonJS. So we see here that I import user store from the file user store, and then I instantiate it here on line 3. And what does that translate into? Well, we load the module user store, which is, this is going to be the name of this module. Of course, this is just an arbitrary temporary variable that's being used in Babel to facilitate its transformation. And then when we instantiate it, we do user store.userStore. And it's a basic CommonJS file. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can write a user store class and export it. So I'm going to come over here, and in scripts, I'm going to create a models folder. And then in models, I'm going to create a user store.js. And after creating that, we'll go ahead and it's not going to find that file, so I'm restarting my dev watch task at the top. And then I'm hitting refresh. So now we have our models and our user store compiled file. So let's go ahead and open up that as well. So now we have our source on the left and our output on the right. So how would I go about exporting a user store class? So I want to write a class in this module that gets exported. Well, it's very straightforward. We do export class users store. And that's it. So by adding the export keyword onto a class, a variable, or a function. So for example, if I said export function debug store, that took in a store here, a user store, and I said console log store, notice how I have export function here. That means that this function can now be imported. If I just in this function local function, this function is local to this module and cannot be loaded from any other module. The export keyword is what performs the export operation. It's what tells JavaScript, hey, this thing is accessible from other places. Think of it kind of like the public keyword in a class in a language like C#. So that's the basics of exporting. Now, exporting has its own syntax. There's a couple of interesting things we can do with that, but we'll take a look at it later. But for now, let's go ahead and I'm going to open up the compiled code for application.js on the left and user store on the right. So popping open the compiled code in application.js, we now see what happens when we export, and we see what happens when we import. So I can make this example a little bit more interesting, actually. I should have probably done this by importing, in addition to user store, importing my debug store function. So I'm going to do debug store, and then I'll do debug store store. So now I have that going. Let's open up the compiled form of both of these at the same time and talk about their output. So remember, the export and the import doesn't do anything special, except for have Babel output all of this additional module loading code that needs to be used by an external system that we haven't imported yet. So bear in mind, there's nothing magical about the export and the import syntax. Babel's not going to do any sort of checks to make sure that certain modules have certain things. It's just going to blindly output this code. So let's look at this code. On the left-hand side, we have application.js, and we have a very basic, what looks like a Node program. We use the require function. So notice how we import the entire module, and then to access the specific imports inside of it, it just does .blah. So in this case, it invokes the user store constructor function. And in this case, it invokes debug store. I guess I'll really quickly point out why Babel turns user store or debug store invoked with store into this 0, user store debug store. The reason for this has to do with variable scoping, or rather context. So basically, what this does is, because we're doing user store, Babel is turning that entire module into a single variable and then accessing its exports by doing dot. If I had done user store, debug store, store, if this was what Babel outputted, there would be a huge problem. That problem would be, now the debug store function is being invoked on the user store module, which is not, module object, which is not what we want. we want it to be executed in the global context. And to do that, you use this funky syntax here. This syntax would be equivalent to be doing something like this. Var ble equals user store debug store, and then ble. So by invoking ble like this, without having an object before it with the dot, it'll invoke this on the global object. In the case of the web browser, that would be the window object. So that's why this funky syntax is here. Anyway, oops, didn't mean to do that. All right, so now let's take a look at the right-hand side. Again, this should look very familiar. We have this like class call check and all that fun stuff that Babel throws in when we use classes. The important thing is look at this, exports. Exports should look pretty familiar because that's how in CommonJS we define our exports. We say exports dot the thing we want to export equals another thing. So we see here that exports.debugStore equals debugStore. Now, because of JavaScript hoisting behavior, exports debugStore equals debugStore can be done before that function is defined. So our function is defined down here, but we can use it up here because of variable hoisting. And we also see that var userStore equals exports.userStore equals then the actual class. So we're exporting both of these in CommonJS format. You'll also notice something interesting here too. When Babel transforms this, it adds this ES module flag, which is picked up by certain other tools to say or to know that we're working with ES modules. And even if this is CommonJS, that we're still in the context of having used ES modules. And it's picked up by Babel and other areas in certain circumstances. It's not really that important though. The important thing is exports debug store and exports user store. So that's basic CommonJS. So yeah, let's do one more similar thing here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pop open my source users, or I'm going to pop open my models folder, right click, and I'm going to create a new class called user.js, or a new file called user.js. And I'm simply going to say export class user. And we'll just leave that as it is. And then inside of user store, I'm going to go ahead and import it. We won't be using this quite yet. We'll be filling out this code later. But I'm going to say import user from user. So a couple important things. We're using that same import syntax that we saw before with the curlies, where I put everything that I want to import by name in a comma-separated list surrounded by curlies. Of course, I can do that if I wanted to. But even VS Code, because VS Code does understand ES2015 syntax and ES2015 modules, it's going to tell me that it has no exported member called this. However, like I said before, Babel doesn't care. It's going to blindly import that, as you can see. Well, we're not using it, so it's not going to do that. So if I said .ble, for example, notice here it blindly imported that. So bear in mind that Babel is not going to intelligently handle these modules when they don't exist. Anyway, so that's that. So we now have this user class. Interesting thing to note, we're doing ./user, so we're loading the user file from its own folder. So we've seen examples of how we can export classes, how we can export functions, and how we can import multiples of things. There's another thing to note about how we can use the import syntax, and that is defaults. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. In scripts, I'm going to create a new folder called controllers, and I'm going to create a new file in this called users. Or how about userscontroller.js. Now, what if I only wanted to export a single function, or I wanted to export a function that gets imported by default when I import it? So a default function. Well, not surprisingly, we simply do export default function. In this case, I'm going to create a function called usersController, and usersController is going to get a mount node and a usersStore object. So export default function allows us to import this in a different way. Basically, I can now hop over to application.js, and I can import this function, this usersController function, like this. I can say import anything I want from controllers users controller. And then just to make sure that we get some output that we can debug and take a look at, I'm going to go ahead and invoke this function. Now again, this is just an arbitrary function name when I just slammed my keyboard, but that'll make sense why I did that in a moment. So let's talk about the syntax real fast before we look at the compiled code. Notice how I do not have any curlies. By not having any curlies, we are going to import whatever was exported by default from that library. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the compiled code and see how this translates into CommonJS. I can come over here, open up application.js, and I can come over here and open up userscontroller.js. Now, users controller, notice how we still do our exports. We set the ES module property on our exports object, and then we say exports.default equals users controller. Users controller being the function. Now, how does it get imported? Well, notice how we have our users controller right here, and it says equals, and notice how that when I just hit the keyboard randomly, notice how that's completely gone. Babel doesn't care about what we name the thing. It only cares that we're loading the default. So the name is completely irrelevant and actually gets lost from the compiled code. Now, it says users controller 2 equals interop required default. Here's an example of it taking advantage of the existence of the ES module. Basically, this is saying the interop required default function, which is added automatically by Babel, says if this thing was created with Babel and ES modules, go ahead and import it directly. Otherwise, wrap it and set its default to that object that was returned. So this makes the syntax compatible with CommonJS modules. So just to make that clear, that's why that helper function exists. It makes it compatible with default functions that weren't generated using Babel and were written by hand in the CommonJS format. And then you see when we invoke it, we get that same silly little parentheses, 0, comma, and then invoking the actual function. All right, there's 2 more ways to use the import syntax that I want to talk about, and that is loading everything and loading nothing. So how do we load everything? Let's say we have a module here. I'm going to, under my scripts, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it, I don't know, lib. Inside of lib, I'll create a utility. Or how about just util.js. So I have this utility JavaScript file, and he's going to have a bunch of functions in them. So we're going to say export function func1, console log func1, and export function func2. So let's say we have this awesome little library function, or library module here. So here's our util.js. What if we wanted to import every single function from util.js without having to manually specify every single one in a list surrounded by curlies, like what we did with our user store? To do that, we simply do this. Import star as anything, so star as bleh, from libutil. And now we can do bleh func1 and bleh func2. So again, when we want to import everything, we just do star as, and then the alias to what we want to import it as from the util. I went ahead and chose bleh here, but the reason it doesn't, I'm just trying to demonstrate that you can type in whatever value you want for this alias. Usually you would do something like star as util from util, because that would make more sense, but this just underscores my point. Anyway, let's go ahead and see how that gets compiled. If I hop open to scripts, I'm going to open the application.js, and then I'm going to also open up libutil.js. Now, libutil, nothing special. We're just doing straight up CommonJS exports, just like you would see in any Node.js application. Now, on the left-hand side, we see var util equals require libutil. And that looks like straight up CommonJS code. And then we have our bleh, so this is our alias, and it is it's assigned to, or interop require wildcard util is assigned to that variable. And again, interop require wildcard is a function that simply goes in and it sort of makes sure that we can use this module by importing other modules compiled by Babel or importing modules that were written in CommonJS in the Node ecosystem. All right, there's one more syntax I want to talk about. So let's go ahead and close these guys out. I'm going to go ahead and just create a script. I'm going to come in here into my scripts folder, and I'm going to say, create a new file called script.js, and all he's going to do is say console log, whoa, not very interesting. No exports. He's not exporting anything. How would I import this? Well, it's actually very simple. I simply do import script, and that's it. So you don't have to specify a import list or an alias or anything like that when you just want to load in a single script. So what does that compile into? Well, if we hop over to scripts application.js, notice how it just imports into a naked require statement. So that script just gets loaded, executed, and the results get thrown away because there are no exports that we're wanting, and we're not importing anything anyway. And that's ES2015 module syntax. So there's a couple more things I want to talk about, but we're running out of time, so we're going to do that in the next video. So see you guys then.